baby. What are you doing? Welcome back. All right. A few more folks here. It's usually a little less populated, but all right. So let's go ahead and get started because we got a lot to get through. We're probably gonna skip some stuff that I think is less important, and that's okay. All right. So we have talked a little bit about committing things to your long-term memory, but there are a couple ways that we could sort of hack the system to make it work for us. Because again, when we are talking about creating long-term memories, we're talking about creating meaning. That is the best way to describe that that I can come up with. So one of the ways we can do this is by using a mnemonic. So some type of device, an acronym would be another example of this. First letter technique, method of loci. So the examples I give you here are Roy G. Biv, which is remembering all the colors in the rainbow. And then down here, again, if we have any musicians, all of the lines on the treble clef, GBDF, every good boy does fine. There's also one for the spaces, which is FACE. And then bass clef, you have good boys do fine always, and all cows eat grass. So all of these things, all these little phrases help us remember what goes where. And this is done through what we call elaborative rehearsal. Like you remember those things by creating these little devices, but by also repeating them a lot of times. Over a certain number of days and months and weeks is also an important part of this. What they say here is that spacing is key, this idea of distributive practice. So spreading out study sessions over time with breaks in between. So if we have any people who like to cram in here, wait until the night before the test to just like throw a bunch of information in there, I can go ahead and tell you that the research says that you are not going to remember that stuff nearly as well as if you had spaced that out adequately. I know that's inconvenient, but that is the reality. Okay. Sleep and memory, also how much you sleep benefits how well you commit all that stuff to your long-term memory. Now, why does that happen? Well, we've discussed earlier in the semester, I think it's in chapter 2, about your parasympathetic nervous system and what you are doing while you are resting. One of the things, in addition to using the nutrients from the food that you have eaten to like repair broken down muscle tissue and do things like that, you're also processing your memories while you're sleeping. So the more that you sleep, the better you sleep. So they mention REM sleep here and memory consolidation. That gives your brain and your body enough time to filter through the information you've given it and put it into the right place. Wakeful resting is also an important part of this. So what does that mean? It means doing things that you find restful while you're awake. So it's not always just about sleeping, but in the middle of the day, going for a walk and letting your brain just relax and process all the information that you've given it instead of just going from thing to thing where you're paying attention constantly. Finding activities that are restful to you is important. So if that's playing sports, playing video games, what have you, something that gives your brain a little bit of time to rest and recover and filter through all the information that you have sent its way over the course of the day. Okay. This is probably my favorite slide. One of my favorite slides of the whole semester. So a retrieval cube is a stimulus that helps in the retrieval of stored information. It's difficult to access. So the example they use here is Justin Bieber. Okay, so let me explain this as best I can. So Justin Bieber a few years ago was on a very famous song called Despacito with Daddy Yankee and Luis Fonsi. Not on the original version, but on the one they played a lot in America because it was in English. So Justin Bieber sings the chorus of that song, and the chorus of that song is in Spanish. Justin Bieber does not speak Spanish. So when he would try and perform that song live, he had a little bit of trouble remembering the words in the language that he doesn't speak. So what he had to do was he had to prime that information because it was there. It was in his implicit memory because he had sung that chorus a lot of times for recording that song. But he had to use a retrieval cue, which I think was the word Dorito, which is kind of funny because that's a made up word. But so if he thought the word Dorito, then the rest of the chorus would appear in his explicit memory and then he could sing the song. So it's kind of a silly example, but a good one. Again, a retrieval cue is just a hint that you use to recall a bit of more complicated information from your implicit memory and bring it into your explicit memory so that you can use it. All right, so we talked about the difference between recall and recognition. Recall is retrieving information without retrieval cues. So that would be like your essay questions. Recognition is picking out the correct answer from a series of answers that you're given. So you've given the retrieval cue. And the question here is, which of these two processes is generally easier? The answer is definitely recognition is easier. So multiple choice tests are definitively easier than essay questions, which kind of makes sense because you're not having to come up with the entire answer on your own. Now there is this thing called the serial position effect, which basically says, and we'll explain this through the hypothetical they give you here. So if you are a server at a restaurant and a group of 10 is sitting in your section, you got to go serve them. You are more likely to remember the orders of the first 2 or 3 people and the last 2 or 3 people than the ones in the middle. Okay, so how does that work? Well, the primacy effect says that because the people at the beginning their orders will be rehearsed in your brain for longer and more often, you're more likely to remember those orders. And then the recency effect, because the last people were the last things that you rehearsed and they were more recent, you also remember those as well. So the things at the beginning and the things at the end will be more easily recalled. Things in the middle will probably suffer a little bit. All of that together is called the serial position effect. The primacy effect is the beginning. The recency effect is the end. And you definitely need to know all of that for the test because there will be at least a couple of questions about it. But we will definitely review it more next Wednesday as well. Okay. Encoding specificity principles is basically the idea that your memories are context adjacent, at least, if not context dependent. And so memories are more easily recalled when the context and cues at the time of encoding are similar to those at the time of retrieval. So you're more likely to remember stuff about the psychology of memory if you are recalling it in the same exact place where you are right now, because this is where you're receiving that information for the first time, most likely. An example they use here is that they did this experiment where they got people to encode memories underwater. They were more likely to remember it when they were underwater as opposed to being on land. Hey, okay. Also dependent on mood and how you feel. So state dependent memory says that remembering things when your mood, so your physiological, which is your brain chemistry, and psychological conditions are similar at the time of encoding and retrieval. So if you were happy when you first encoded a bit of information, you're more likely to remember it when you're happy again in the future. And then mood congruence, if you are sad at this moment, you are going to be more likely to remember sad things, and the same is true for happy things as well. So those are slightly different ideas, even though they sound quite similar. State-dependent memory means that the mood at time of encoding, mood at time of retrieval matches up. Mood congruence is the idea that you will remember things that are congruent with your current mood. So again, remembering sad things if you feel sad. Okay, so talking about the forgetting curve. So this was developed by a guy called Hermann Ebbinghaus. So he used a single subject design, so just one person, a lot of times was himself. He noticed that he would try and remember a string of numbers over a certain amount of time. And You just repeated this process over and over and over again. And what he found was that as he went along, there was a very steep drop off in his memory capacity early, so in the first couple of days, but then it plateaued. You can kind of see that represented graphically here. So 0 days after repeating that number, it would still get it pretty right. But then just a couple of days, and you can see from 0 to 2 how much it drops off graphically. And then eventually it plateaus. The question here is, how can you apply the forgetting curve to material you learn in class? Well, if you did nothing between now and our next test, which is next week, and just said, okay, well, I learned this information a couple of weeks ago, everything will be fine. Hello. Then that will put you somewhere in like the 10 to 15 day range here. And you can already see that a lot of that has dropped off. So you will be not nearly as likely to remember what we talked about today in 2 weeks than you would if you were to rehearse it the night before. So repeated exposure to these things is an important part of memory because memory decays relatively quickly, even if it is something that is meaningful to us. But a lot of times it's not in class because it's class. All right, so example here, memories can decay over time. Storage failure occurs because either you haven't rehearsed it or it's no longer relevant to you, so you just kind of forget it. There's a lot of stuff that you've probably taken in classes before that you were like super strong on the day of the test, and then you don't remember at all anymore. So like I, at one point, knew a lot about the various political machinations of civil wars in South America, because that was a class that I took in high school. I do not remember any of that stuff now because I haven't looked at it in a very long time. So they're there technically. So if I went back and looked at that stuff again, it would come back to me to a certain extent, but I don't remember it at all. And again, another example here, even if we can't get to them, memories may be distorted or inaccurate. And we'll talk about how that can happen. Retrieval failure, they talk about here the tip of the tongue phenomenon, and they give you a couple of actors here to try and remember who they are. So the example in the middle here, we'll use him because he's super famous. If you couldn't remember who that guy is, and you were like, I think he's in Moana and a bunch of other stuff, and I just can't remember his name, but I told you that it started with a D. You're like, Dwayne The Rock Johnson. That would be retrieval failure, but then a retrieval cue that helps you prime that memory. But let's say you haven't seen a movie with him in it for a while, and so that memory that you had decayed, but then my hint helped you. Okay, so this idea is kind of complicated and would definitely need to be reviewed because they can get confused quite easily. So proactive interference is things that are being interfered with now. So the tendency for information learned in the past to interfere with the retrieval of new material. So if I've already learned Spanish in the past and I'm trying to learn French now, there's a good chance that the Spanish I learned, all those weeks and months ago will have a negative effect on my ability to learn French. And then the opposite is retroactive interference. So if the French I'm learning now is interfering with my ability to learn Spanish, then we call that retroactive interference because retro in the past, something that I learned in the past, is being affected. And you can kind of see that represented graphically on this page. But that's just something you're going to have to rehearse a few times just because it's a little tricky to remember, but there will absolutely be a question about that on the test, distinguishing between those two things. All right, we'll talk about HSAM for a second. So HSAM is being able to remember your episodic memory to like a spectacular extent. Basically, you remember everything that's ever happened to you. And what drawbacks exist with HSAM? That kind of sounds like a nightmare to me. I don't necessarily want to remember everything I've ever gone through. That's the biggest question there. But why this doesn't happen for most people is this idea of the Reconstructionist model of memory. Because memory are understood as creative blendings of fact and fiction. Okay, because we tend to edit our memories after a certain amount of time. So especially if it's something that happened to us, a few years ago, we can creatively pick out the things that we don't want in there, and then maybe even add new stuff that wasn't there. And then also we can have things from external influences coloring our recollection of these things. An example they use here is the actual debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton pre-2016 election, but then conflating that with the SNL skit of Alec Baldwin and Kate McKinnon portraying those two candidates. So what might happen is, and this happens a lot with movies that are like based on true stories, is that because usually the parody or the historical account of it, the dramatized version of it, think about like Titanic, something like that, where it's, yeah, they're using actual things that happened, but they're also adding things or rearranging things to make it more dramatic and make it into a better movie. But our brain has a tendency to mix those things. So even if we were very tuned into, all of whatever was happening. So talking about this example, if we watch that debate, then that's great. But if we also watch the SNL skit afterward and sort of mix them in our head, now we have a distorted memory that is not actually reflective of what happened. And we do this all the time in our own experiences. And that's bad because it leads to this thing called the misinformation effect. So the tendency for new and misleading information to distort one's memory of an incident. This is obviously not super useful when we're talking about somebody who's like a witness in a hearing or in a crime. Eyewitness accounts, other important events might be altered by factors that come into play after the event occurs. There's a very famous example of an experiment where they asked one group of subjects what happened when two cars hit each other, and they asked another group of subjects what happens when two cars smashed into each other. And even though the subjects had seen the same video of the incident, and there, it wasn't actually that bad of an accident, the people who were asked what happens when the cars smashed into each other were a lot more likely statistically to report like glass being broken, cars being totaled, people being injured, things like that, even though none of that actually happened. Even just that one word, though, saying that it smashed into each other instead of they hit each other was enough for their memories to be altered. And so example they use here is somebody initially reporting correctly that this suspect had a beard, because you can see his picture over here. But then a few days later, after they had heard from somebody else that he didn't have a beard, they altered their own memory subconsciously. They didn't do this on purpose to have him not have a beard, which he clearly does. So that is the misinformation effect. That and the reconstructionist model of memory both go hand in hand. We can also create these things called rich false memories. So we can create memories of things that never actually happened at all, which is kind of wild, but is completely true. Lost in the Mall study, what happened was they got a bunch of people and got their relatives to ask them about the time that they got lost in the mall when they were little. And for most of the people, that never actually happened. And about 25% of the participants, nonetheless, were actually able to remember that time they got lost in the mall, even though that never happened. So we can create these, full fleshed out memories of things that never actually took place because, again, we are very creative editors of our own story. All right, amnesia. This is the last little group of things that we'll talk about. But amnesia, you've probably heard this term before. It can have physical or physiological, psychological causes. Varies by type and degree. So amnesia is a fancy word for memory loss. And there's two main types. So we have retrograde amnesia, which is things that happened in the past that you start to forget. And then anterograde amnesia, which is an inability to create new memories. So going back to Clive Wearing, he has anterograde amnesia. He does have a little bit of retrograde amnesia too, but mostly anterograde amnesia, which means he can't form new memories. All right, that's just that represented graphically. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you too many questions about the structures of the brain that make all this happen. There will be a couple of them. So the main ones that I would ask you about would be the prefrontal cortex, which is what you can see up here. It's where all your working memory happens. So talking about your central executive, episodic buffer, that kind of stuff. That's your prefrontal cortex. And your amygdala is important because emotional memory is a very important part of all this memory recall stuff. The hippocampus, so we're talking about explicit memory formation. And then your cerebellum is implicit memory formation. So those four things are fair game on a test. So prefrontal cortex, amygdala, hippocampus, and cerebellum are all things that I could ask about. All these other things are sort of tangential to creating this thing. So like your auditory cortex, visual cortex, all that kind of stuff. So that is your sight and sound memory. But all of that just kind of funnels into your amygdala, hippocampus, cerebellum, etc. All right, and how do we come up with all this? You figure out all this kind of stuff. A lot of different brains have been studied, but HM was probably the one that's the most famous. So we talked earlier in the semester about how epilepsy is notoriously tricky to treat. So he actually went through this process of ablation, which is another term that we learned earlier on, to remove certain parts of his brain, including the hippocampus, to hopefully treat that epilepsy. And what happened was it resulted in anterograde amnesia and a little bit of retrograde amnesia. So he wasn't able to form new memories because that's what happens if you take out your hippocampus. And then he has mild retrograde amnesia, but he maintained his implicit memory. So going back to like your procedural memory, that is incredibly resilient. It sticks around for a remarkably long time, pretty much regardless of if you take out bits of your brain, it still happens. This is probably going to be something that I ask you about for the weekend. So just get ready for that. Infantile amnesia. So what is the question here? The hippocampus plays a central role in laying down new memories. But the frontal cortex, which isn't developed by the time you're, a baby, and even into like early parts of your childhood, the hippocampus is critical in creating explicit long-term memories. And so in the case of infantile amnesia, earliest memory varies from person to person, but the main reason that like infantile amnesia happens, where you can't remember everything, like going all the way back to the beginning of your whole life, is because your prefrontal cortex is not developed as much. That takes a while. And we talked a minute ago how your prefrontal cortex is very useful for retrieving memories. Well, if you don't have a developed prefrontal cortex, you're not going to be able to retrieve those memories that happened when you were very small. So for the weekend, I'm probably going to ask you what your earliest memory was and why you might remember it. Because again, we've talked about deep processing and how we usually remember things that we have a strong emotional connection to the most. So asking about your earliest memory. So mine would probably be something like when my dad took me to my first Braves game, which I think I was like 2 or 3 when that happened. But I have a very strong emotional connection to my beloved Braves. So that memory obviously stuck in there pretty well. All right, long-term potentiation. This is one of my favorite parts of this whole conversation. So imagine your memory like you are walking through like a field of tall grass. Okay. Now, if you start down, initially there's no way to find your way through that large field of tall grass. There's no paths that have been laid down. But if you keep walking along the same way over a certain number of time, over a certain amount of time, over, months and weeks and years, eventually paths will start to form. And the ones that you walk down the most will form the best. So this is the idea of long-term potentiation. This is exactly how your memory works in the long term and how you're able to learn new skills. So increased efficiency of neural communication over time. So you're just making those paths more well-worn, more distinct, more efficient, which is resulting in your brain in learning the formation of memories. And the way that they figured this out was studying a sea slug. And so here's what happened. They squirted water at the slug, and over a certain number of trials, the slug learned that it would retract its gills whenever the water got squirted at it. And so again, long-term potentiation, over a certain number of trials, over a certain amount of time, we develop better neural connections, and we get better at learning stuff. So this slide's kind of sad. So we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, named for the guy that discovered it, a guy called Alzheimer, weirdly enough. We do not actually have Alzheimer's, I don't think, but Alzheimer's is a progressive, devastating brain illness that causes cognitive decline, including memory, language, and thinking problems. Somebody you know quite likely to have Alzheimer's because it's relatively common. There's two main physical features to it. So there's neurofibrillary tangles. If you've ever gotten, unless you're in the AirPods crowd, but if you've gotten your headphones tangled up, that's basically what's happening there, just with your nerves in your brain. And then they also have plaque developments on those nerves in your brain, amyloid plaques that prevent that information from passing efficiently. We're not 100% sure what causes this. We think it's some combination of genetics, some lifestyle factors, so diet, exercise, exercise also including mental exercise. So if you're waking up and doing the Wordle every morning, you're in a better shape to hopefully stave off Alzheimer's in the future. That's obviously not the only thing that you can do, but that is one thing. Oh, here's just a chart of all that stuff when we'll go through this. But if you're curious about memory loss and aging, I wouldn't ask you a question about this on the test, I don't think, but just some research that backs up ways to hopefully decrease memory loss as you age. Most of them are like intellectual stimulation, social activity, maintaining a good social circle is a big part of this, exercise, and then your genetics are also a piece of the puzzle as well. All right, last thing we're going to talk about today is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, otherwise known as CTE. So we have a lot of NFL fans in here. This is something that is very much a part of the football conversation because football is where we first really discovered this phenomenon and where it has become the most prevalent societally. So what is CTE? It is a neurodegenerative disease that leads to atypical deposits of this protein called tau throughout various regions of the brain as a result of repeated mild traumatic brain injury. So ramming your head into a bunch of stuff a bunch of times. All right, symptoms: significant memory issues, impulsivity, aggression, insomnia, problems with speech, and depression. So it can have a lot of impact on somebody's life, but unfortunately we cannot diagnose it while they're alive. So we have to be able to look at their brain in detail to see if this tau protein has actually developed, and you can only do that when somebody's dead. So it can appear months or years after the initial impact, which is also inconvenient because you would like to be able to diagnose it early so you could treat it early. But there are a lot of implications for youth sports because football in 20 years is probably going to look pretty different to how it looks now as we continue to learn more and more about CTE and implement better helmet technology and try and find a way to make football safer and incur less head injuries. You see a lot of players retiring early to try and avoid it. This is also why the targeting penalty exists. And so you've ever watched a college football game and seen somebody get thrown out of the game because they hit somebody with their head, with the crown of their helmet. That's why that exists, to hopefully stave off something like CTE, because these are very young people. We don't want to have to subject them to this. And this is just a slide that shows you what CTE looks like over the course of time. So stage 1, relatively healthy brain tissue, but that tau protein starts to accumulate. And eventually, by the time we get to stage 4, the symptoms worsen. And you can see that cortex is just shriveled up and gross and sad looking. It's not a healthy brain tissue at all. And that is why we see a lot of the symptoms that we see, the impulsivity, aggression, even violence towards themselves and others. Okay, that is it. Whew, that was a lot of stuff. But that is it for chapter 6. That is all the stuff we will do lecture-wise for this test. Next time, it's just going to be a quick review of the back half of chapter 6, what we did today, and then we will jump into our review Kahoot next week before our test, which will be next weekend. And then we, for this weekend, I will post something in your discussion board. I'll make an announcement about that as well, just so everybody knows. Probably about infantile amnesia. So if y'all have any questions about the chapter, about the test, any of the stuff I've done so far, I've graded most of your assignment 3s, almost done with those. And yeah, I should have those done by the weekend. If you have any other questions about anything, please send them my way. But that's all I have for you guys. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and I will see you next week.